So, welcome to part 2 of the review, and we're going to be talking about early urban, the next phase, phase 3. So in this phase, much like the second phase of farming, there were increasing complications, and cities became more and more complicated, and there was a need for some rules so that people could live together happily. And early urban life threw up some new diseases, of course, much like the previous one. So we often think about early urban life, diseases like Black Death in those early times, in European times, due to vermin, infested houses and so on in the Middle Ages. But slum living in those times, as they are today, threw up a number of diseases, and even today we have diseases such as cholera and tuberculosis and so on. Survival in those times, in the early urban times, were related, as Jared Diamond says, to guns, germ and steel, and only those really who were most adaptable survived to pass on their genes. So it's pretty grim for many people. We needed guns to protect the granaries and the warlords. We needed steel to make the tools and guns, of course, and people who were living in poverty, as they do today, died earlier and often of disease. So some whole societies did perish along the way, either because their local environment changed or they were killed in competition. I'm trying to, here we go. So what happened? Well, you can see here there was population explosion for the reasons I described earlier in the farming era. Indigenous people were displaced and so on. You can read those, I won't go into it. But farming started the process of stratification of society, where the upper layers of society don't contribute to the food production, and then all of the other, and so on. So the difference between the top and the bottom layers are, the sick of the society, and we know that now. It was very important to live in the top of the hierarchy, and during this time we became very dependent on technology, even more so, and as I said, education and laws were needed. Health, food, nutrition, law and punishment, these were the things that changed dramatically during this time. Health, ideal breeding ground for bacteria in vermin, in stored foods. There was waterborne pollution from wastes. There were epidemics from viral and bacterial diseases. Long distance trade sent diseases from one city to the next. The story for women was bad. Females become chattels. In terms of food and nutrition, there's a lot of contamination. As we've talked about, dependence on a single crop is a problem. There could be feasts or there could be famines. Law and punishment was an interesting one. There were a lot of dietary prohibitions emerging during this time. People observed certain diseases emerging from eating certain things, and so there were, if you like, public health measures without real understanding of what was going on, other than people getting sick from eating pigs, probably from liver fluke, and shellfish, probably from cholera. Marriage laws changed, property laws changed. What was the disease that reached the 15th century in Naples? Well, it was syphilis, And you know, what are the, you know, infectious diseases was a big health problem during this time, can I say. What's the similarities between syphilis in reaching Naples in the 15th century and HIV reaching Western society in the 1980s? And it was really that through travel, again, faster travel, or the ability to travel, and of course affecting young people in particular. Where does cholera happily reside? This was a problem at the time, and of course it's water, and what, you know, are the social circumstances in which cholera live. Well, if, you know, when there are no sewage systems, and there's obviously a contamination of drinking water, and, you know, people living in poor living conditions, slums, refugee camps, and so on, unless you've got some infrastructure in place. And so you need to think about, as a health professional, what would you do if where the system failed, and what would you do, because cholera is everywhere and around the corner. It's just that in this society we have systems to deal with that. So, you know, if there was a failure of a clean water supply readily available, what would you do? So we move into the next phase, our changing relationship, you know, again with increasing complications, social, physical and environmental changes. And you will remember this slide. You know, there were two major phases during this period of time. And there were, you know, one of the things I think that we need to mention about this early part of the Industrial Revolution, really, there was the emergence of scientific thinking. So really, the old reality of a set of beliefs, and just going with that, rather than, well, you know, the testable laws setting, you know, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and so on, emerged. So we were accepting or rejecting hypotheses, much as we do today, developing some theories and establishing some facts. And this is the sort of thinking that emerged during this time. And it was based on, but as it is now, you know, probability, not absolute certainty. And so, you know, so the science method, if you like, was established quite well in this time. So it's you know, it just means a way of knowing. Around the time, though, there was some not so great things. The Enclosure Acts, inequalities were increased during the Enclosure Acts, where the land was the common land where people could grow vegetables and perhaps graze a cow and what have you in places like England. They were fenced off and given to the aristocracy, and so that increased the inequity during those Enclosure Acts time. Other things that happened during this time, you know, technology, of course, ramped up considerably. You know, we had the steam engine and spinning and weaving machines and so on, and we became, of course, technologically dependent on these things, as we are today. But you know, the downside during this time was that you know, cities were filling up with toxic pollution, and you know, there was an unstoppable use of non-renewable resources. There was a rapid development of war machines, and colonialism was rampant. So not exactly a happy time. In the health sector, though, there were some great achievements, and you know, the public health responses to illness at this time. We realised really that diseases were caused by a number of things, and you know, if people's nutrition improved, and if we separated waste from water, then, you know, life health and well-being would be better. Mortality from infectious diseases fell during as a result of some of these social policies, and mainly social policies. And so we had compulsory education. There was government regulation on in health. There were hospitals emerging, so there were also, as I say, the downsides to this phase as well. One of the if you like, legacies from this time was, this notion of growth economies, and humans forgot and have still forgotten how to live in a no-growth economy, or haven't re-established how to do that, meaning that the natural capital is not taken into account. Attempt to live within our planetary means started here. And people started and are still fighting about resources, and that was to produce wealth, more wealth for the wealthy, technology, fighting over rival technologies, and as I said, this has continued. The hierarchies got steeper, and we started running out of resources, and of course our techno addiction continued. There was, of course, physical, some of the physical problems, degradation of ecosystems continued, and that idea of technometabolism, which I'll come to in a moment. I just want to give you some key words, the inputs and the outputs and the pathways. So it's all about technometabolism, all about outputs, key words, overconsumption, increased waste, depleted raw materials, and so on. I won't read them out. And an important notion during this time to remember. So technometabolism, if you see here, it's a cyclical system. Natural metabolism, inputs, outputs. It's much like the mature ecosystems I was talking about in the farming idea. Whereas, and you will remember from Too Much Stuff, or whatever that video was that I showed you in the last session, a linear system. So inputs, raw materials, metals, fossil fuels, chemicals, outputs, structures, manufactured goods, and so on. Waste accumulating in a linear system. It's a very important concept. As I say, a similar sort of concept to mature and immature ecosystems. Social wars during this particular period, world wars during this particular period, really led, in terms of responses, or health responses, to organisations, reinvigorating organisations, should I say, such as the World Health Organization or its predecessors, and the United Nations, because it was realised globally that war was very unhealthy, and there were many refugees and many people suffering as a result of these wars, and so these global organisations were developed to try and there was a recognition, if you want to use Boyden's term, to that something had to be done about it, and there was a certain amount of knowledge around that time. These, they thought, were the means to addressing some of these problems, considerable amount of political will at that time to sort these problems out globally. During that time, I just wanted to alert you to, this is really where we started to notice great differences in comparing, say, the diet of hunter-gatherers and ourselves. We've talked a lot about that, but it continues. And I think, to have a look at this slide and look at, the sorts of messages that are being talked about today in terms of diet and what that might say to you. Psychosocial and behavioural differences between hunter-gatherers and modern societies. You know, just to summarise, I want you to think about the either deviations between then and now. You know, social support and wisdom of the elders and traditions. How many people you knew in cooperation. Participating in a variety of activities and being creative, and you know, how we're supposed to work in this economic environment these days. People having a wide variety of skills in hunter-gatherer times, and the rise of specialisation through those transitions. You know, the sense of purpose and meaning and belonging, which people talk a lot about today, but there's a lot of disconnection. You know, connectedness is healthy, and during that time, you know, short achievement cycles compared to long achievement cycles that we have today. So I want you to think about those differences and what those evo deviations might be. We had 4 SWAN videos, and in your exam I'm going to concentrate on one of those videos, and that's the first one. There's some marvellous information in all of those videos, and excellent material, and particularly this one talks about the high, you know, or late industrial period, and the first episode was about loss of control and what that actually meant in terms of disease. And he talks about, if you remember, the Hantan fever that emerged in the Korean War. He talks about a country's loss of control, and he talks about Hungary. He talks about a loss of control diet in indigenous communities. So it would be well worth you looking at that video, that first video again, and looking at that major idea of loss of control and what the implications for that are under different circumstances at different levels. So, you know, evo deviation, we've talked about this a lot. You know, you know, every time we change the way we live, or something changes in the way we live, we've had some problems emerging. There have been positives and negatives in these transitions. The negatives in farming were zoonotic diseases. In early urban life, they were crowd diseases, and much like in industrial slums, they were systems diseases, really. And in high energy societies such as the one we live in now, well, we have you know, many degenerative diseases. So there's some of the evo deviations from past transitions. And then we come to the one we're in now, and some people are naming this the Anthropocene. And it's a bit hard to see what the Anthropocene looks like, because, as I say, when it's just, you know, we're really at the start of this. But, you know, even though life expectancy has increased overall globally, health and well-being is not experienced equally by any means. And we know what some of the problems are in this transition already. We know that we're altering the planet. We know that there is degradation of the environment. We know what problems have emerged. We know that in 200 years, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the main but not only gas that contributes to the changing climate, has increased by more than 30%. So we know that already. We know how to reduce it. And so we're going to experience more intense and more frequent weather events, and this is going to have an impact on our society, and particularly those most vulnerable in our society. But there is a way out, and we need to move from antidotal and dead-end cultural adaptations, so, ideological decisions, to taking a much longer-term view, and we need to think about what the corrective and cultural adaptations are. And sometimes the people who first recognise what these problems are, called first-order reformers, are often derided and called all sorts of horrible things when they first raise the issue of some of these problems. We do understand much of some of the problems that we find today, and we can understand more using evidence-based practice. We generally, globally, have the means to deal with it. If we could share more equitably, we could do that. And so then, of course, it comes down to the political will. What do we want to do? And so sustainability is a word that's used on and off, or ecological sustainability or sustainable development means that we meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations. And this has been around for a very long time. It is a process. It's a process about equity. It's about a process of social justice. It's a process of environmental justice. And it's not hard. Well, it probably is hard given the circumstances we're in, but the idea is not hard. It requires a lot of political will. Clearly we need clean air, water, and we need the temperature to be in, as I've alerted you to, the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, just right. But we also need, nutritious diet. We need adequate proteins, and carbohydrates, and vitamins, and minerals. We need social norms that don't encourage weird eating habits. As I've said, we need optimal contact with bacteria and viruses. We need, great emotional network, caregiving, care receiving, and so on. Light work, realistic expectations. We need to, nap when we're tired, and so on. We need a variety of daily experiences. They are the optimal life conditions, and we need to match those up with these common behavioural tendencies that Boyden came up with all those years ago. You need to think about what are the ego deviations from these common behavioural tendencies. So eat when hungry. What is a deviation from that? Drink when thirsty. What is a deviation from that? Copulate when appropriately stimulated. What is a deviation from that? Avoiding pain, seeking comfort, sleeping when tired, taking the easy path. What are the modern expressions of those common behavioural tendencies? Epicurus had a few clues about this. Countries are now measuring human life by human health by means other than economic growth. For example, the happiness index, and as I said, Epicurus in 341 BC, we came up with a few ideas about how we might be happier, what is necessary and what is neither natural nor necessary. And you might like to come up with your own examples as well. We've talked a lot about inequality, and I know you've talked a lot about inequality in the social determinants of health. It is a major factor in health status worldwide today, and in the spirit level we talked a lot about how more equal societies have better overall health and social conditions, and it's about the gap, and so it's about relative wealth determining the health and social problems, not the absolute wealth. And some countries do it better than others. So if you've got a country where they have low inequality or higher quality, you've got countries such as Sweden and Norway and those Scandinavian countries and Japan. If you have countries that have high inequalities or low equalities. You've got countries such as the United States and Portugal. And as I say, some do that better. So the social forces that shape our lives, which is one of the quotes that that Norman Swan uses, but I've used it here to talk about inequality. You know, food production, how that's produced, manufactured, marketed, and distributed. He talks about the antidotal responses such as war on drugs. And these are the things that have the greatest impact on our health and well-being. And we know where we can get reliable information. As I've said, on many occasions during this subject, you know, science is a systematic enterprise of gathering knowledge about the world, and we need to organise and condense that knowledge into testable laws and theories. And the way you find that is by doing the experiments or research yourself, by using scholarly journals, academies of science, and sources such as the Cochrane collaboration and so on. As Boyden said, you know, successful prerequisites for successful adaptation are these things. Did we recognise the problem? Did we understand the underlying process? Did we have the means, and did we have the political will? All right, well that's, I'm going to finish it there, but you'll see at the end of the slides, you will see that there are a few slides that covers Janelle's slides on microorganisms and toxicology, and I'll leave you to look at those slides yourselves and look at the notes that she presented and the lectures that she presented to you, because there are still, I think there are 7 questions, perhaps 7 questions on this at the end of your exam. And so, you know, the relationship between microorganisms and humans can also determine whether a state of health or disease or outbreak or epidemic or mortality or morbidity will occur. So you need to have a look at that. There's a little summary there for you. All right, all the best for your exam. And as I say, start with these notes and work backwards from there. Use your student learning guide, and I'll see you at the exam.